Thank you for joining. Sorry for the slight delay. We had a little bit of a technical issue, but we're getting kicked off. Thank you for joining our webinar, Updating Your Consent Experience for a Modern Privacy Landscape with Ensighten and Forrester Research. Today's webinar features Enza Iannopollo from Forrester, and she'll be talking about the lay of the land for 2022 in privacy. Next, you're going to hear from Marty Greenlow, our CEO at Ensighten. He's going to talk about kind of a state of the industry and how to move past the basic consent experience. Lastly, Jason Patel, CTO at Ensighten, is going to give a real hands-on example of the right way and the wrong way to do consent. And with that, we're going to pass it over to Enza in just one moment.
So again, without further ado, let me take you through this presentation about updating your consent experience for a modern privacy landscape. I want to start from talking about the privacy regulation landscape. I remember 2018 when Europe was preparing to make GDPR ready for enforcement. It really felt, and also the years before when there was all the discussion about updating the regulation, it really felt like something unique, something just one of a kind as a piece of regulation. But since the moment, since 2018, we have seen a range of privacy regulation being passed, and today, I think we are comfortable saying that privacy regulation are really gone global. Some of the latest number that I saw suggest that 137 countries around the world today have some kind of data security and more privacy regulation in place. So really a lot of them. And you can see here in this landing page how different geographies, not just Europe, but really around the world, privacy regulation has become just a reality. And I prepared here a list. Actually, I included very last moment Connecticut. Yesterday, that bill was passed in Connecticut. So from January 2023, also the privacy regulation in Connecticut will become enforceable. It's very similar to the one that we've already seen in California, in Virginia, Utah. But you can see the list, how many countries really have recently passed a privacy regulation. And India is the next one that we are expecting to see a new broad privacy regulation there in the country as well. So really a lot to look at, especially for those businesses that have operations or customers or employees in different parts of the world. We have also looked actually at how different companies are doing in respect to these different pieces of regulation. You can see this data. This is new data that we have collected interviewing 800 privacy professionals globally. So that gives a little bit the sense of the scope of the survey there. And as you can see, I say privacy is a little bit of an ongoing journey, is work in progress. While there are some organizations that feel that they have made progress, they are fully compliant with some of these privacy regulation. Most of them are still trying really to optimize the strategy, to improve what they are doing, and so it really feels there is a lot of work in progress. One out of the list is Virginia. There are about 20% of firms that are saying that they are complying with the requirements, and my guess is those firms are those that actually have already complied with California, or they had other privacy regulation to comply with. And this tells you that actually when you put some foundation on your privacy compliance, then you are really ahead of the game when it comes to complying with new regulations. So that's the other aspect of investing in privacy compliance, the fact that you get those foundation going to really help you out, comply with upcoming requirements as they become mandatory. Another element that I like to discuss always when I think about privacy regulation, I've been covering this space for about 10 years now. So I have seen a few examples of privacy regulation and companies complying with those requirements. When I look at the landscape of this privacy regulation, it becomes evident that actually there are some specific requirements that, regardless of the specific regulation, they come up over and over again. Of course, there are little adjustments and there are little difference every time, but really the core of the requirement, the principle, the privacy principle stays the same. And of course, consent the one that we are going to discuss today as part of this webinar, but there are others that are definitely becoming very popular with privacy regulation. And again, if someone was to ask me, how do you set up those bases, how you set up those foundation in your privacy program so that actually you can comply with multiple regulations and they become available, I would say, if you look at these requirements, if you look at these specific principles, those are the one that most likely will keep appearing over and over again. These are sort of the backbone of this privacy regulation. And so if you wanted a priority list, if you wanted a kind of which is my starting point and how do I develop further, I would say look for these principles and make sure you are really optimizing around them to get ready for the next privacy regulation, the next update, the next change. Let's look at also regulators. Every time that we talk at how the regulation is passed from a government perspective, that's an interesting data point. But also we want to know how companies are doing when it comes to the enforcement, and more precisely, are actually regulators enforcing these rules. And here's some data. I looked. This is data from yesterday, so pretty fresh there for you. 40% of the fines that have been issued so far for GDPR compliance have to do with consent-related requirements. This tells you how much high up in the priority list is the consent piece for regulator. Again, it's a large number of those fines and a large number of companies that are still struggling getting these requirements around consent right. Examples of some of these enforcement action, you have this, one of the latest of the French regulators that are with a fine for the dark patterns, really looking at the way these consent banners are presented, how the user is presented with the different options for consent, for managing consent. Regulators are saying sometimes it just doesn't work. Companies are not doing a good job at presenting those options, at choosing the language and the visual that they need to use to gather consent from their user. And if you're thinking, well, this is a European thing, well, actually is not, because here are some examples that even prior to the one I just showed you, and this is the Federal Trade Commission, and so relating to children privacy specifically, but as you can see, Europe, the US, and all the other jurisdictions, actually, regulators are paying attention to the specific way in which companies comply with the requirements around consent. Why it is so difficult? It seems straightforward. You need to ask me permission if you want to use my data, if you want to track me. It seems so obvious, but we are seeing companies are indeed struggling complying with these requirements. So why has become such a complex issue? Well, first of all, let's make sure that we appreciate why consent is so important and how it really contains two aspects that are extremely important. On one side, there is, of course, the need to comply with the requirements for consent because it's regulation. We have seen regulators will enforce will have fine and enforce the rules against companies that don't comply with those rules. But at the same time, is about the relationship that you establish and that you maintain with your customers. Is really that handshake that you have with your customers where they are coming to your website or when they are returning to your website. So I like to frame the discussion considering these two aspects. On one side, consent management for compliance, at the same time, consent management as a customer engagement moment, as really that handshake with your customers. When we talk about consent, there are a few different things that we want to consider. There are different types of consent that are included in these regulatory requirements, but also that your customers coming to you, your website, your pages might be experiencing. Cookie consent, one definitely of the most common consent, and the one that we are going to also talk about more in details today. Consent for subscription for marketing communication, universal consent. Are you opting out? You're opting in into a loyalty program? Are you opting in some specific personalization programs? So they can have consent for very different use cases. There will be consent for a number of contractual clauses, depending on the specific page on your website or the kind of business or brand that you are, and also the case of withdrawal of consent, which is used in case of opt-in by default, but fundamentally is taking away the customer data if the customer is saying, I don't want to share my data with you anymore, I don't want to be tracked anymore. That's the other side of consent management, if you like. Cookie consent specifically, I said, is probably the most common use case that we all know about, that we all have to comply with. But it seems so easy, but actually it's not easy. So the very first point that I have here is that consumers have become extremely aware of how consent banners work, of how they have rights, and what they expect to see in those banners. And you can see here just an example, the number of consumers that actually are taking their complaints to regulators. They take the time to fill a form in those websites for the regulators to actually see that there are companies that are not doing that work properly. And another example is when actually these complaints for customers are not only very important in terms of volume, and by the way, the French regulator said that when they would see 3-4 times a complaint for a practice in an organization coming up, they would definitely open an investigation. So there are times where actually complaints from the public have brought regulator into opening proper investigations. But also there are other cases where the regulator had to go back and think about whether further guidance was needed. Is the case of the Dutch Data Protection Authority that at some point experienced so many complaints from citizens about how companies were dealing with cookie consent that they felt they needed to provide new guidance because they felt that the market wasn't educated enough about how to handle those specific requirements. So the action of consumers can be very pervasive. So not only they are very familiar, have become very familiar with the rules, but they really are also making regulators aware of when things are actually not working. And then GDPR really changing very much the way we understand even cookie consent. In this case that I have here, the Planet 49 case, the regulator will make a very precise assumption, which is even for cookie consent, we want to see active consent. We would extend exactly the same expectation that we have when we regulate consent for other use cases. All those expectations apply when we deal with cookie consent. So once and for all, clarifying the cookie consent needed to comply with the full discipline of consent management as it is in the GDPR in this specific case, but then really extended across regulation. Regulators, I said, have also felt that maybe they needed to provide more guidance to organizations. Again, once more reinforcing the idea that cookie consent seems so easy, but actually is not. And really organizations need to think clearly about how they implement these strategies. One piece of feedback that we gotten from a regulator was first of all, that as you implement those strategies, they want a clear and positive action from consumers, that signal we are giving consent to use to track my data. Scrolling down the website, that is not a standard for consent. Maybe it was in the past, but definitely not today. Information has to be very clear. Users need to understand what you are trying to tell them. If you want to track them, what are the purposes for that? And that communication must be very clear. And also, this is an interesting point because sometimes I still hear, well, if cookie goes away, then all the problem is solved. It doesn't work like this because, as you can see, regulators are clear in the fact that it doesn't have to be necessarily a cookie. It can be any technology that is going to store some information about or is dropped into the user device, can be pixels, can be other things, but the same logic apply. If you want to track the user, if you want to track the personal information of the user, you will need to have in place consent to make sure that the user is aware and you are as a business in a position to actually do what you are planning to do. And then the idea that no essential script or other technology can run on a machine if the user hasn't given consent. And that's something that I believe is the most common mistake. The idea that, well, I can track users and if they say no, I can try to reverse engineer what I'm doing. That is not in compliance with the rules, that is not definitely meeting the expectation of customers. So something, a practice that companies should be very aware of as the wrong way or really thinking about consent management. And so here is my sort of summary. What many people are thinking, well, consent, the cookie consent is a banner, is actually what you see when you go to a website. Well, the reality is there is so much more than the banner. You can see there, the banner is probably the outside of the cake that I have here, but what's inside consent management, the cookie consent actually is, first of all, who are the third parties that are running the scripts on my website that I don't even know about? And that happens all the time. There are third parties running scripts, collecting data of your customer from your website, and typically organizations don't even know that that is happening because they're not monitoring who is on their website getting that data from their customer. Second, you need to stop tracking, or you have not to track at all if a consumer is saying, I don't want to. And so again, this is a typical mistake that I see all the time, where actually tracking starts anyways. And then, as I said, you try to reverse engineer. Not the way it should be done. You need to make sure that nothing runs on your website until the customer has given consent. And when consent is given, because there are very different typologies of purposes, you need to make sure that you are tracking user and using that data exactly for the purposes that that is supposed to be for. So if they are saying yes to analytics but not to personalization, you need to have technology in place, process in place that are going to make sure that you comply exactly with those customer choices and that consent notice. And then it's not just one layer. You should be able to control how that data travels down to downstream systems that actually are using that data. So really creating a lens there for enforcing and monitoring those user decisions down in the downstream systems. And of course, you also want to be able to show a regulator, if they come knocking your door, that you are doing everything right, that you have the right processes, the right technology in place. And in fact, what you expect to see are these solid compliance logs and reporting that can help customers really show that they are doing the right things with data and with the consent management. So it's definitely the idea. We see the banner, but there is so much more that you have to take care of for cookie consent. Now, the banner, however, is placed. I love this quote from Professor Azok that actually say even the interface itself plays a very important role in the way we are allowing consumers and users to protect their privacy. So as you are thinking about all the pieces that have to come into place beyond the banner, again, it's important also that we consider how are we displaying that, which opportunities we have to actually display that. Now, data here, about 60% of companies out there are using software to help them with their consent management needs. And we have also seen that privacy budgets, especially for technology investments, are growing. And one of the drivers for it is definitely the need not only to comply with requirements and regulation, as you see there, but also actually to meet increasing customer expectations. Again, reinforcing the idea that this discussion about consent management and cookie consent is as much as a regulatory need, as much it is about meeting the expectation of those customers. And here I want to just take you through some examples about why consent management, it is indeed a customer experience opportunity. Data shows there that consumers are paying attention in the way companies are managing privacy. This is not just because they know their privacy rights, but also is helping them making those purchase decisions. Here, data from European consumers, you see across countries, above 50% of customers are saying that the way a company treats my personal data actually affects my willingness to do business with that specific company. And here you have data from the US as well. Again, very similar proof point there. Consumers are looking at privacy when they decide to buy products or services from organizations. So as you are thinking about what you need from a technology and process perspective, here's some guidance about what you need from also from an experience perspective. And here's some example. My slides are slowly maybe me. There you go. First piece of guidance there is leverage plain language and provide clear options. An example here, a website. You see the little C there on the corner on the lower left corner. When you open that, you can see clear indication of the different cookies organized by processes, and a very easy way for consumers to get informed, to understand exactly why you are asking them to do, why you want their data, and then an easy way to really make their choices there. Another piece of feedback is about the really the value exchange. Consumers understand there is value in their data, and they understand that when a company asks for their personal information, that company is gonna get value out of it, and they want just a piece of that value. And you can see here an example of companies that are trying to really build a value exchange with their customer. Here an example of someone offering a 40% discount if you were to join their mailing list. Another there is instead giving back these great news and content designed for those that want to subscribe to that specific campaign they are running. And another example of someone that says, if you share my data with you, there is a gift for you. Again, all example and just ideas to think about as you think about a value exchange with your customers. And also we know from empirical evidence that actually keeping the privacy communication on brand encourage customers to share their data. There is an idea that if they trust the brand, and if they can see the same kind of color and language and look and feel in the privacy pages, they carry that idea of trust with them as they consider that content. Typically, privacy pages or consent notices tend to be all, or in the past even more, they tend to be all very similar, and there was not much differentiation going on. Today, this is changing, and definitely we advise customers to go on with their really own brand communication. Even for a cookie consent page, as you can see here, this is from the Thesaurus, and of course they are giving you the definition of privacy. Or another example from this seller of the pet foods that has in that little banner still a lot of the reference to the color of the brand, the language of the brand, and what they do. And then finally, building contextual messaging. The idea that you don't have just to put in front a privacy banner or a consent banner randomly on the website during the exact moment I come there. But the idea that you can think also how to provide those consent notices within the specific customer journey. The example here is of this retailer that is gonna ask you to actually subscribe with one click if you want free shipping on all orders, and they're gonna show you the specific banner after you have started filling in your cart. So it's a communication on privacy that really happens at a specific time of your journey as a customer. And similarly, this other example is about someone that is asking, after you have paid for the goods that you wanted to buy, if you want to share their personal data with them, or the credit card details with them, and if you want to see the privacy policy. Again, this happens just after you have paid, when there is a less tension because you have completed that transaction, and maybe as a user now you are willing to say, yes, I can just give you my credit card information, consent to use them to make my next interaction more easier and more convenient for me. The last point that I'm going to make, and then I'm going to pass the floor to Marty, is about also the business value of this. We have talked about compliance. We said this is all about the customer engagement and the meeting the expectation of customers, but also there is a lot from a business value perspective. Just one example to tell you what I have in mind is this example. It comes from the CMO of an international television network. They are in the US, but they have they reach other countries, including Europe. And at some point in the past, they had to rethink what they were doing because actually they needed to ask for consent. The CMO tried to fight that because he said asking for consent for some of the work that we were doing was really difficult. We couldn't imagine people saying, yes, I want you to have my data, while in the past they could have access to all that data without asking. So the CMO had to accept the idea that the rules changed, and indeed they needed to ask for consent. But the result was actually very surprising to him because he said, some consumers have said, yes, I want to share this data with you. And he could launch a hyper-personalization program that he said I could not even imagine before. So it's true that having permission to use data actually provides you with an opportunity to do much more with it compared to before, when we were grabbing data here and there, but actually that came already with some very specific limitation that we couldn't overcome. And there are other examples of how companies, through consent, have really made strategic changes in the way they are gathering their digital assets, they are getting data, and the stuff that they are doing with that data has definitely sparked a lot of innovation and a lot of collaboration. So think about consent management also as an opportunity to create innovation for your organization. Now, with this, I'm gonna thank you for your attention. I'm going to give the floor to Marty, who is gonna take you through some slides.
So what's happening in the industry? The privacy landscape has exploded. There's been a 700% increase in vendors over the last few years. And most of these offerings are surface level consent solutions, banners, workflow solutions, and reporting items. Many of the compliance fines are for technical problems out there, for data processing and insufficient security measures. And that makes up almost $500 million of the GDPR fines. And compliance laws require technical solutions for preference enforcement and security, client-side security. So these workflow solutions, these basic consent software, they do not have the enforcement or the security technology that's needed. So what do we have? It's just like the inside of the cake that Enza had as an example. So let's talk about what a basic CMP workflow looks like and what she was referring to. What's happening out there is that before a customer even consents, their PII is leaving that website and going out to other marketing technologies, advertising, social media, marketing analytics companies. That is not right. So what should happen, everyone? Okay, PII does not leave the website at all and only goes to technologies that an individual consents to. So in this example, and what happens in Ensighten, this individual did not consent to advertising, so that information, their PII, did not go out to those technologies. Pretty simple, very easy to view it from this point, okay? And so what we need to think about is how do we get into this more from a technology perspective? So with that, I'm going to kick it right over to Jason Patel, and he's going to take over and show you a little bit of a deeper dive into the technology side of things. Jason, it's all yours.
So yeah, just as Marty said, let's kick it off and go into an actual real life example. So what you're seeing is something we did find wild on the internet. So, just to show you, this stuff does happen. But what we're going to show you is we've accessed a site that does follow under regulatory requirements from France. So all our experience should be oriented such that, this would be conforming to European privacy laws, particularly French privacy laws. So a lot of stuff that Enza already just talked about in regards to what consent is required and, behaviors around it. So getting into it, we can go and straight up to first, right off the bat, what can we see? We see that without any opt-in or active consent given, you can see that data is collected by default. So on the right-hand side, you can see Google Analytics collecting data around page view data, around other site behavior data. And then on top of that, the other thing that should be probably standing out to everybody is landing on the site didn't prompt a consent experience to pop up, right? Since no consent was provided, there should be something that asks you already. And that's kind of one of those dark patterns that Enzo was alluding to as well, where, maybe there is not a way to remove consent, but it's hidden somewhere, buried in a cookie policy somewhere else. And again, this is stuff you'll get fined over on GDPR. But going into how do you solve this problem, right? Because obviously from anyone that's done a digital marketing implementation, we know that this is a hard problem to solve. There's a lot of, for these implementations, there's a lot of things going on, right? You have multiple teams working on this stuff. You have a myriad of technologies doing random stuff across your site. So what happens when you throw something like Ensighten solution on the page? So first, also getting into it, there's other risks that emerge from not having certain GDPR protections and technologies around it. So third-party vendor management is another great one. you could see here an example of data being swiped off or skimmed off the page. And during the last few years, this is one of the things we heard about constantly across the news, with web skimming becoming more and more of a common way to see data get lost from, or get data, our customers' data get stolen outside of our firewalls, right? So this is another way where we could actually better protect our customers and also earn their trust as well. So what happens when you land on a page with Ensighten on there? So first and foremost, obviously, consent experience is configured to pop up, right? But again, you can see right off the gate, no data is being tracked. And why? Because no consent has been provided. You require active opt-in, and nothing has been opted into yet, so nothing should be collected. And just to give you an idea of like how easy this was to do, we did this without even needing access to this website or anything like that, right? This is all just from me using a little Charles proxy on the internet and being able to go at it from there. So just stressing like, hey, this is a solution that is easy to use. Now, what happens when consent is provided? Well, exactly what you'd hope for as a marketer, or anyone else that lives in that data ecosystem inside any of these companies, is data finally is allowed to go forward and be collected. And this is another part of the advantage where, hey, we don't need to worry about the requirements around every one of these technologies. We don't need to know which ones are collecting what data for that is, maybe consent permission permissible or not. We could go ahead and restrict them out the gate. On top of that, you could regulate what type of data is collected in these requests, and also you can limit the amount of data exposure you have, because as one of the commandments of GDPR state, you should be only storing and collecting data that you actually intend to use or make use of or have some business need of. Historically, in the digital marketing world or any type of ecosystem, we've kind of had this attitude of collect everything, and GDPR or any other privacy regulations forced us to rethink that. And then last but not least, just as a joke, you can see data being exfiltrated here. And obviously with a solution like Ensighten, because the solution regulates what third parties are on the page and what they're being allowed to do, you do suppress anything that's not already been audited or already been approved by InfoSec, or collecting data that is not permitted by your company or allowed to by your relationship with particular vendors. So giving you more coverage in terms of a privacy and security, data security in particular perspective, to make sure that your organization stays in compliance. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Chris, and we're going to go, oh, sorry, just a quick summary. Last bit, so, how does our solution work? No reliance on third parties. So this is not one of those things where we're going to fire off a request to somebody else and hope that like, hey, maybe this thing will, maybe XYZ vendor will drop all that data for that customer, right? At the end of the day, when whatever regulator comes around, you can't go ahead and point that finger pointing game, right? If anything, you both are going to get in trouble. The other side of the fence is, provide users a way to actually get their consent enforced, right? One of the quickest ways to lose trust is if someone opts out of data collection and you are still collecting data and they become aware of it, you're going to lose that customer's trust, and it's going to be really hard to re-earn it. Also, the experience is extremely customizable. As Enza said, you could take these opportunities where this is just another touch point with your end user. So now you can go ahead and enable that to be more customized to your brand, use brand specific language, potentially drive certain behaviors that maybe incentivize customers to share data for you. And then on top of that, this is comprehensive compliance as far as the client side is concerned, right? We actually look at this from the perspective, what does GDPR and CCPA and any of these other privacy regulations, what is their intent from an end user perspective? What is their intent from a data collector perspective as it exists in this ecosystem? And we go ahead and conform to those requirements. And last but not least, as with all these privacy regulations, there is a security component to them, right? There is these requirements that are emerging that say, hey, you need to actually make reasonable attempts to secure your end user data, right? make sure you have reasonable cybersecurity measures in place. This provides another layer of that, where previously a relatively unguarded portion of your ecosystem, the stuff that gets delivered to your end users' devices, was kind of lost in the wild. Now you can put some controls around it. Now you can have some security around it and give your customers a better experience and potentially a safer one too. And last but not least, just, as I said before, solution's super easy to deploy. We did this just without even needing any internal access, don't need any engineers, don't need anything else. You could do it pretty much right out the gate with simple drag and drop options. So with that, let me pass over to Chris Vincent. He's going to go ahead and run our QA session.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. We do have a couple questions here in the chat already, but we'll give everyone a few minutes. We got about a minute and a half left here, but we'll extend a little bit if you guys want to hang out. If you want to ask any questions to any of our panelists, Enza, Jason, or Marty, go ahead. I actually have one in here. I'm going to direct this to you, Enza. It's more of a comment, but it's interesting. It goes along with what you were saying. The art of getting consents must be beyond just what regulators want via laws of regulations, because customers don't get them. Customers seek value-oriented consent experience. So can you elaborate on that a little bit, Enza? It's more of a statement there, but what are your thoughts on that, around the value-oriented consent experience?
Absolutely. I think that is exactly the way companies should be thinking about consent management. As I said, the requirements are there to make sure that consumers can have these and can make these informed decisions about sharing their data. But the other parts there really of the game is making sure that we are sharing the value with customers, with them. We have actually data that is suggesting that consumers can be encouraged to share their data depending on what they expect to receive back out of that exchange. Discounts, VIP experiences, loyalty points. There are a number of strategies that companies are putting together to actually encourage users to share data and really sharing their value. One last point on that is that we still have a large portion of our consumer population, that especially those that are skeptical about companies doing the right thing with their data, they feel more comfortable sharing data, and the value for them is being able to easily make their choices. To see that as a consumer, they can go back to a website and maybe withdraw their consent or ask for access, ask for deletion. So the idea that that organization is doing everything as it should makes them feel comfortable sharing data. For them, that's the value also that they expect as a result of sharing their data.
Enza, I appreciate that. Guys, we're actually running out of time here, so we're going to go ahead and conclude. Sorry we didn't get to the last few questions there, but I appreciate you guys joining, and everyone have a great day.